Welcome to Organizational Sherlocks, the podcast where business meets psychology and your organizational puzzles meet their match.
Join us for captivating stories and practical solutions to unravel your toughest challenges.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Fleming.
I'm Morgan Ashworth, your guides to a prescription for business success.
Let's dive in.
So, listeners, today we're unpacking one of the most consequential decisions a leader makes, and one of the least examined, unfortunately. When a capability gap opens in your organization, you have three options: build the capability from within, buy it through a new hire, or borrow it through a contractor or fractional resource. Most organizations default to one answer without ever asking the question, though.
Yes, and we will get to all of those questions that we should be asking, but we're going to go through all three of these options. We're going to talk a little bit about when each one works, when it fails, and what IO psychology and operations strategy together tell us about making the right call. But we're also here to give you a practical decision framework that you can use the next time you're, staring at a gap in your org chart. Our hope is that by the end of this episode, you'll have a different way of thinking about workforce planning, not just as an HR function, but also as a core business discipline.
So, listeners, as always, we like to give you a scenario to think on regarding this. So, let's say a company's director of operations resigns. Within 48 hours, there's a job posting live on LinkedIn. 6 months later, they've interviewed 40 candidates, made 2 offers that both fell through, watched 3 team members quietly absorb the extra load until they burned out, and lost institutional knowledge that walked out the door. Yet they still don't have anyone in the seat.
So that's a great scenario. I've seen this happen far too often in the world, and I actually think that the idea or the concept of talent lead time is a really important concept for us to talk about, particularly when it comes to workforce capacity. And being again one of those kind of core business components as a part of my MBA program that I'm doing, because who doesn't love school, right, Morgan? Just keep going on going. We're talking, I mean, it's fun. I like learning and I'm learning a lot, so it's really great. But, this part of my international operations management course. So I'm learning a ton about a lot of different things, and maybe we'll hear about it on the podcast. But all in all, really where this is coming from is that it takes time. Talent lead time does take time, right? I see this in organizations who kind of wait until they have an urgent need. I'm not really trying to forecast what internal capacity they'll need based on what their kind of hard data tells them their forecast should look like. And so that's really why I wanted to bring this up here, because we spend so much time as organizations really thinking about, forecasting, supply and demand, supply chain issues, whatever it might be. But I think because people and the idea of people is a little bit more abstract, a little bit harder to measure, it's something we just kind of don't think about, and we really should.
No, I agree. The time of 2 weeks to maybe 4 weeks for a leader notices and being able to hire someone within that, it's gone. Absolutely gone. It takes longer to hire because it takes longer to find qualified candidates. In fact, they say that you should you should have about 37% of your applicants before you really start looking at anyone. Typically, that's the runoff is that about 37% of candidates, the first 37 is not a fit, or there's only going to be one from those first 37%. But anyhow, not to get too off topic there, it's the time of 2 week notice and hiring within that, it's gone. And so forecasting, especially when it comes to people, capacity, and capabilities, is so critical. This is actually why I do tend to say that there should be a level of redundancy in organizations, because if something like this were to happen, like an emergent situation, do you have the capability to manage it right then? And maybe if it's not an internal redundancy, maybe it's an external one you can quickly go to for help. But I think that might relate to what we're talking about today.
It sure does. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of this idea of knowing what we need and knowing what we actually need now, but also in the short term and in the long term, right? If you're someone who does forecasting, that probably sounds relatively familiar. And there's lots of different models and everything to utilize with forecasting for product or service, let's say. But you can use that same kind of technique when you think about people. And so, what we're going to offer to our listeners today is this idea of building, buying, or borrowing. Okay. Just as a simple concept, the three B's: building, buying, and borrowing. Building is really recognizing that there is some internal capability that you already have existing within your organization. This is really in line with what Morgan and I talk about on this podcast pretty regularly around, do we have the capability that we can develop into that role? That's the idea of building. So, building equaling development. Okay. We also have buying. Okay. Now I know that sounds kind of weird and icky, but we're just trying to keep it with the three B's. So, buying is really about the fact that capability does not exist internally. You need something else. And so you look
Mhm.
externally. This is where that LinkedIn job posting maybe comes in. You're looking for an
Born a
external resource. Yeah, exactly. So that's buying. And then borrowing is a little bit more on kind of the fractional or contract economy, if you will. So bringing in someone as a contractor or as a fractional, maybe fractional executive or something like that until you can figure out kind of what is it that you need and what kind of, person do you want to bring on in full. So that is what we're going to do today, is really dig into the build, buy, borrow model. So, Morgan, I'd love to just kind of start a little bit, if you're okay with it, starting with the build. So, again, that internal ability. What do
I
you
feel
what do you
like
think about that?
So I feel like build is a great one to start with because I would argue that it tends to be the default for organizations because the goal is always to develop your internal people. It's always easier to promote someone internally since they already have a really great knowledge of the organization. So you're not just trying to so you're only trying to train for the position and not train them to know the organization, unlike the buy model. Yes, I do feel like the buy model for more senior levels is more common, but for management and other types of internal promotions, I feel the build level is so, so common. So let's talk about when it's the right answer, right? Let's say internal capability exists in a nascent form. So the role requires deep organizational context. So again, that I just said, that organizational knowledge, and the timeline allows for real development. So to me, this also can tell you can determine that the build model will be right pretty soon, pretty early on. I could highlight a team member after 1 year of employment and say, that person right there might be my manager in 5 years, as long as everything goes according to plan. And so this is the forecasting side of build, is you're not just trying to build right then and there when the senior operations manager resigns, right? You're not just trying to build at that moment. You've actually been trying to build this person for a level of time. That is the forecasting side of things, right, Elizabeth?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I know. As you're talking, I was thinking, well, this sounds a whole heck of a lot like forecasting on the business side. Because there is a lot of overlap there. One thing that I notice in my work a lot, and I hear about this all the time, is the idea of high potential employees, right? And wanting to invest, some organizations, I guess, invest in high potential development, right? Where this goes wrong, and I just want to say this because it's very true. And I think a lot of business leaders might find value in this, is your high performers do not always equate to being your high potential employees, right? And so when you think about it, just because someone has been there a long time or consistently gets their work done and does it well, it doesn't mean that that potential is exactly the same. You might be overlooking some of those individuals that haven't been there as long, but have a whole heck of a lot of potential, right? So, really, what we're thinking about, and part of where an IO psychologist or the work that Morgan and I do, where this comes in handy is really assessing for readiness of an internal resource as well as potential. And so that speaks to what you just said about, like a senior manager, right? Maybe isn't ready now. So again, that readiness isn't there, but they might be in 5 years because you see that potential. And knowing that is a very strategic decision for a business.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also even like to talk about the times when, you didn't necessarily foresee someone leaving. And so you weren't developing as quickly as maybe you should have been. It's hard for an organization to really read into when someone's going to leave. Usually, with more senior level positions give longer term, like notices. Um, but still, there's times where there's a very short notice period and there were very few, factors that pointed that this person might be looking to leave too. And when that happens, you might want to look at something like learning agility. So how quickly someone develops new competencies, because that's a strong predictor of their development success. I can think of a scenario where this organization I was working with, they had a strong team under a leader, and suddenly the leader just up and left. There was truly nothing behind it. Um, the individual ended up moving closer, like working closer to home. And so there was a need to quickly change over. And company knew that buying was not going to be the right route because of the skill set required. It has a really strong organizational context and specific context to what the job was due to like software usage and whatnot that the company uses in a particular manner. So their option was to build. That was the only option. And so they quickly highlighted someone. This person was actually already in development, just not as far along as they should have been. And so there was a more structured approach of, okay, so this person's in a transitional role to get that next role instead, because they weren't ready for it right then, but they could be ready for it with more coaching if this coaching and the development timeline is sped up significantly. So instead, the manager over the management position was meeting with this individual who was promoted to team lead very quickly on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, and working with them and helping them really develop that leadership style for themselves and develop those boundaries, thus leading to success of this person entering into that role within 6 months instead of another 2 years of development.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and what I'm hearing you say when you gave that example is that there was an intentional act of providing resources to this person
Mhm.
and support to this person. And I think that's really in the build kind of category where things can go wrong, right? We look at building not just as a cost savings because you're not recruiting and onboarding and all that kind of stuff, but all in all, it really is an investment. So building is that investment, right? You have to be ready to invest. It's not a shortcut, even though it might appear that way to some people. It's not a shortcut. I think really when if we boil it down, if you're not willing to resource or provide resources for development, you're really not choosing to build in the way that we are describing it. It's really more just of a delaying the buy, right? Because you're not going to get somebody up to speed in the time that you need it to have a great impact on your organization if you're not willing to provide the resources they need or the support that they need.
Yes.
So I think that's really an important part of the build cycle is understanding again what learning agility is, being able to identify whether someone's ready, what their potential is, and I'll even throw in a little piece of are they even interested in another position? That kind of matters quite a lot. And then to your point around that structured development planning, I think really having a structure to that and being able to create a unique plan based on the person rather than just a kind of one size fits all solution is really the way to go, especially if you want to get people up to speed quicker.
Yes, no, I would completely agree with that. And I also think of it as, when you're developing a leader, when you're trying to build a leader and you're investing into that time, even if it's, you're trying to invest more quickly and more time into it within a few months, and kind of taking on work with the upper level managers taking on the work in the meantime, it's okay to invest this extra time and extra, I guess, money in a way to these leaders, because to an extent this each leader will have their own style, and it becomes extremely important to customize it to this leader. When you have a general team, maybe you have like 10 people on one singular team, 20 people on one singular team, could be 5 people. Every team's a little different, but let's say you have a size team like that. Well, their development might look roughly the same and not really customized, because to customize to 20 different people is a lot. But when you're customizing to a leader, that extra level of customization, that extra level of investment will help lead to more success down the road.
Yeah. And I will say it's not impossible to do that. I will say that though, because while yes, it is more of an investment to customize, I think that these same concepts can be applied to people at all levels of an organization. And I only say that because sometimes you don't have someone in a manager role, but they're maybe in an individual contributor role, but you see that they have the potential to move up. So you may start that investment while they're still an individual contributor to get them to a manager, to get them to a director, whatever it might be. So I think a little bit of this is organizational preference, if you will, depending on the organization. It is possible, and there are consultants that do work with folks on developing these programs. So know that you don't have to do it alone. But again, it is possible, even though we tend to focus more on the leadership side of things more regularly.
Yes, 100%. You're so correct.
All right. Well, we've talked a little bit about the build area, so we're going to call that one 1B, and now we'll go to 2B. And Morgan, I'm wondering if you will walk us through what that means. Feel free to use Shakespearean language if you would like to be
Yeah.
or not
To
to
be or
be.
not to be. I know. We were
Yeah,
talking
well, let's
earlier.
take us through the buy.
Oh, well, yes, I'd love to bring us through to be because I think it is better than not to be, right? So anyway, lever two is buy. So we went through build. Now we're going talking about buys, talking about some external hiring. And so this we utilize and organizations utilize when capability doesn't exist internally. The role is more long term, requires deep integration. A fresh perspective is usually genuinely needed as well. But I want to talk about one thing as we get into buy. There are many organizations out there who will post a position and have both internal and external candidates. My question there is, are these organizations forecasting where they know that there's internal possibilities and maybe they haven't been developed to that extent, so they put it out there for both options to try to both play on both build and buy both of those B's? Or could it maybe be a level of they weren't even aware that they had people they could have built? I know a lot of organizations I work with, every organization's a little different. Some immediately go to external hiring. They know they don't have someone that they want to build. Others, they're kind of stuck in the middle. So they go the hiring route, the post route to get both internal and external. And others simply know that they can build someone and they actually don't post a position at all. So again, the
Right.
different methods organizations, default to in a way. And so I feel like buy has a couple ways that you go about it. But all in all, the purpose of buy is for when you need that external perspective, when you need an external person, maybe because you need that external information, experience, and need that new perspective. Other times that the capability simply doesn't exist at the organization.
Yeah. It's interesting because I definitely have seen that as well, where people will post it internally and externally. So again, kind of the using both levers, the build and the buy. And I think that there's reasons for that. And I really like that you said maybe they just don't even know that they have somebody who's interested or is craving that development to get to that point that already exists within the organization. And I find it really interesting because and honestly, I think we could have another episode just on this topic alone because it comes with certain risks, in my opinion. I've been in an organization where they've done that, where they have posted internally and externally and then chosen someone externally. And sometimes that impacts the employee experience of that internal person. And so there's definitely a risk there, right? In how you manage through a situation like that. So I think maybe that's just a whole other conversation we could have because it definitely brings up some thoughts in my mind. Um,
Well, that plays into where the lever to buy might go wrong even is, if you have internal people that would have been interested in the role and didn't realize that you would only look for external candidates, that
right.
communication within forecasting is important too. It's forecasting for people to understand why you're making decisions. And it's not because you should default to your employees like opinions and whatnot, right? It's not for that reason, but it's for the fact that they're more likely to buy into this new manager, this new senior level leader of some sort, if they feel they have like a part in a way or they understand the reasoning behind. But where else could buy go wrong? For example, there's a lot of ways it could go wrong, unfortunately. The scenario I brought up that you offered two positions and both fell through already. There was something wrong with the hiring timeline or with the types of people you were looking at. There was a lack of alignment between the organization and the candidate, even. So one way it could go wrong is if you're hiring for the role today rather than the role needed in 18 months. So every leadership role tends to transition in some way, shape, or form. Their focuses change. And so if you focus on only the needs of, like, say, the projects that leaders in charge of right then and not the projects that they might be involved in 18 months, then that could be an issue. Also, using outdated job descriptions. Yeah, I think it's so
Oh, yeah.
critical to look job description anytime you're posting it. Also, the different types of information you share, pay transparency, for example, it's a law in a lot of states right now. So you're required to post the pay range on the pay. And it's interesting that some still do not, yet they're hiring out of those states. So that's actually a compliance issue right there.
Yeah.
But the way you post your position could target people in different ways. You could be missing new types of skill sets like AI, for example. How else might go wrong? The hidden costs of it. So disrupting internal candidates. We talked about that. Having a longer ramp up time because they don't understand the organization itself. There might be cultural friction, whether it's because of internal candidates or the direct reports of this person. And these are things that rarely show up in the hiring budget. So it was a lot riskier to go with the buy model because if something goes wrong, the timeline increases, the costs increase, and then it can have detrimental effects to culture and cause turnover elsewhere too, or satisfaction issues, or just like the overall, performance of individuals if you hire the wrong person.
Right. Which, I mean, brings up something really important, right? And I'm again glad that you brought all of those different pieces in and brought that into kind of the context of the hiring budget, because we often think of the hiring budget as being something that is just about, how much it costs to post you on LinkedIn, or post a job on LinkedIn or Indeed or something like that. And how much does it cost in their salary? And like all of those things are really important considerations, but all of those other things also are important, right? Again, like the disrupted internal candidates, the longer ramp up time, the friction, the onboarding, all of those things all cost money. And it can be really expensive, right? And this is really a core part, and I just want to bring it up. Like this is a core part of what I and you in our work at Appiday do, right? We try to reduce these costs so
Yes.
that organizations can be more effective, and the idea of getting the right person in the right seat. And I always add to the clients I work with, like at the right time, right?
Yes.
Because we're talking about forecasting. We're talking about where do we want to be in 18 months? Where do we want to be in 5 years? And what kind of
Leader can make it
people do we
work.
need?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a lot that could go wrong within the buy model. There 100% is, but that does not mean it's not the route to go ever. Okay, so I do want to premise that because I don't want to worry too many people out there listening that, oh my gosh, maybe I should just never use the buy model. No, you definitely need the buy model for certain levels of positions because not everyone in your company can manage that. And oftentimes you can't, just dish it out to multiple people in the company either because that could cause burnout down the road. It's simply important that when you're using the buy model, you really have structured scientific backing in your hiring process and not just using your gut feeling. That's when you come to people like us who help with that. But let's talk a little bit more about the science behind it. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so and obviously this is an area I'm really passionate about, so it's something I just wanna preface it, like, I could go on and on and on, but I won't because I know that our listeners probably have days to get back to. But our traditional hiring models really using as to the way you put it, like your intuition or your gut, while that is valuable, and I do not wanna discount that, it is incredibly valuable and it shouldn't be replaced. However, there are those scientific methods that allow us to really get into the key theoretical components of what actually predicts solid job performance for people. And those unstructured interviews, the instinct, again, while valuable, are actually some of the weakest predictors of job performance, right? When you really look at the science behind it. Um, if you want to do more, structured interviews are better. than unstructured interviews, using things like work samples, getting an idea of how they work and what that might look like. Think a strategic plan, or what would you look for in the next 30, 60, 90 days. Those kinds of things are also stronger, right? But what we really know too is that using more of the kind of the cognitive, the personality, the motivational assessments, really get an idea of who someone is, what their skill sets are, and where we can really tailor our budget to invest in their development. Those are the strongest predictors. And most organizations do not use them. And I think that's an important kind of piece because again, it's a core component of what Morgan and I do at Appiday and what other firms do as well. But all in all, I think it's hard because I mean there are estimates that anywhere from 30 to 70% of someone's salary is thrown into all of this onboarding and development initially. And what if you could cut that down and actually make choices about their development and get them involved in things that actually help them build their skill sets? Like, to me, that's just completely valuable.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that having a specific structure behind hiring, the buying side of things is so critical. And there's one point I really, really like to hone in on is there's person job fit and there's person organization fit. Sometimes there's different ways to go about finding those fits, little tests, little like figuring out how they work. Sometimes taking them on tours, senior leaders especially, like taking you on a tour will help them bring up questions, help you bring up more questions. And you really can see their like, I guess their affect against the organization and against the environment as well. But within those, the fit, the job fit and the organization fit is also the value system, the mission, the vision behind the companies. And years ago, actually, Elizabeth and I had a podcast solely on vision statements, actually. And I think
Yeah.
we talked with one CEO, but we also talked just about Starbucks, actually, funny enough.
Yeah.
And I will say when it comes to values, there are specific structured questions you can have behind these values, and you can utilize scorecards within your interview to say how much they meet that value based off of your questions with them. Obviously,
Right.
there's a level of caution sometimes when it comes to values because one, you don't want to necessarily outright ask about the value, but two, you don't want to ask super personal questions either, right? But you want to have structured, almost work related questions that might bring about other types of information that helps see the greater fit. For example, if there's an organization focused on environment, well, does this person recycle? Like, see if that can come about. Honestly, it seems super basic, but it does matter. If this person's not someone that recycles, do they really care about the environment? Let's just ask
Yeah.
that. But then separately, just talking about the environment in general, like, what have they done previously with organizations to add these environmental factors behind what they do? And does that match the values of the organization? But what I said earlier is having that scorecard. So not just taking information and writing down the information on these structured interviews, but also maybe having a scorecard to back it so that you have a kind of a gut feeling of, they land on a 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 for this question in a way. But when you connect that to other people in your organization. Usually there's a multi-step interview process and then later maybe some behavioral testing as well. That's Elizabeth's wheelhouse right there.
It
Then
is.
you'll get a more 360-degree view of the person.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's not about like even though we look at job performance and we look at the strongest predictors of them, it's not to say that it has to replace that an assessment of some kind has to replace those interviews. I think it's about
The
creating more
supplement.
structured interviews. And I think that you can even, and I know because I've done this, I've worked with clients and helped them develop interview structures, but coming up with a value-based interview structure, right? It's structured. And I do want to just say, because I think that this is kind of a misnomer at times, like using open-ended questions does not mean that it is an unstructured interview. You can absolutely use open-ended questions. If you use your environment, example, right? I might just openly ask, what is your perception of the current environmental standards, right? That'll give you a really good idea if they have a similar value or mindset as the culture of the organization, right? So just because it's open ended does not mean that it is unstructured. it can be structured. When we talk about structured, it's really more about applying the same interview technique to all candidates for the same position.
And
Period.
I'd also say that open-ended questions are actually critical, even like it is a structured interview, even with these open-ended questions, because you can create different types of follow-up questions too. But these open-ended questions really allow the candidate to take it the way that they have perceived the question too. So you get to actually get a little bit more insight into, okay, when you ask an open-ended question, like where does this person's mind even go? For example, like let's say quality, of course, is such a critical value to a lot of different organizations, but sometimes there's like a specific true value put into quality, while other times like quality is an expectation of the organization. I worked with organizations where quality is legitimately a value of the organization because there's a lot of innovation behind what they do. And so not only are they innovating, but they're trying to make it the best it can be. And so every product they want it to be the best it can be, right? Or it can be
Absolutely.
applied to service like customer service. But you might ask a question along the lines of, when you have, time constraints, how do you prioritize quality versus timeliness? That's also another open-ended question. It's a little bit more honed in than just like, what's your perception here? But it still hones in on topics, and then you can ask follow-up questions of, well, do you have a time? I love getting examples from previous workplaces too. Do you have a time that you had to do this? Or hey, tell me about a time that you moved away from quality and focused on timeliness. Why did you make that decision? And were there any repercussions because of the decision, or was it okay? And have you had a similar circumstance where there were repercussions, or a similar circumstance that you took a different route, right? Again, that's a lot of follow-up questions. I probably just asked 10 questions right there.
Yeah, you also got to keep in mind the time you have to interview, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, I think that, before we jump into the third lever of borrow, the last thing I want to say about that is by by having a structure in your interviews, you're also creating consistency in operations, right? And so you are essentially rating or considering candidates on the same criteria, which is really important when it comes to kind of equity and all of those different pieces. So just keep that in mind that, when we have unstructured interviews, we tend to invite more bias into that interview process. Structured interviews help eliminate some of that. Not that it's completely eliminated because as humans, we're just, we all have bias, but it does reduce the impact that bias has. And then you add on the layer of more the quantitative data components, and that helps you confirm or deny what you believe to be true about the person you just used a structured interview with. So
Yeah.
that is my 2 cents on that.
And right
So
before we get into borrow, just one last point. Let's just remember that lever to buy does not end once you hire the candidate, actually. You usually have an introductory period. Most organizations is 90 days. And so you're going to have a number of scorecards, check-ins, evaluations of how this person is doing, and see if they're really meeting the skill sets and whatnot that you need. Are they a fast learner? Are they not a fast learner? Is that important? And so many other types of criteria. Usually by the end of 90 days, an organization will determine, is this person staying on the team or not?
right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. I mean, I think gonna think of, when you send that offer letter to someone, it's almost like the journey is starting over again. Not, from a hiring perspective, but you get to know the person and you get to integrate them into your culture and into your world. And I think that's a really cool thing. And it shouldn't be discounted because it can be really powerful. So with that, I'd love to jump into the borrow, which is our B, if you will. I don't have any Shakespearean things for that one, but that's okay. May come up with one later. The what?
I said the 3B is a little high for Appiday Consulting.
There you go. Okay, that works for me. I like that. Now we're getting into some collective identity stuff, which is awesome. But when we talk about borrow or the 3B, the third lever, really what we're talking about is kind of the fractional and contract economy. We are seeing this exploding today in our world. I know so many people who work fractionally or, are looking at contract employment. And I just think it's an important thing for business owners to realize and HR departments is that this is an option as well. It actually is a very strategic option. I do see that a lot of organizations use it more reactively, like, oh my gosh, we just got this huge project and we need to have somebody, so we're just going to hire someone and it's going to be a contract, right? Only for this project. I think there's a lot of power in being very deliberate in how you deliberate and strategic in how you use the borrow lever.
Mhm.
In particular, I think it's important to think about kind of the transactional nature of the contract or fractional employment, right? It's just a feature of it. It's just kind of how it works. It's more transactional. There's actually laws in various states that dictate how you can work with a contractor. And those are really interesting.
Yeah. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
yeah. I mean, I find it interesting to look at it. Like the laws in Minnesota here are different than they are in New Jersey or Massachusetts, right? And so knowing what those laws are, I think it does give you um it gives you an opportunity to learn as an HR person or a leader or a business owner. It gives you an opportunity to learn about what is this lever really all about?
Mhm, mhm, and I feel like that's a big way of how I kinda come in with you, Elizabeth, is I tend to take that HR perspective on what I do, you know? I may be an IO psychology professional myself, but I did go into the HR realm, no matter how much people argue IO and HR aren't connected, and I honestly am so glad I did because I'm on the strategic side of HR, and when you think about contracting, you can forecast with organizations of, or you can even have a plan of, oh my gosh, if we need to switch to contracting, maybe we have something in place already of we're prepared to do that, right? Obviously, right before you implement it, you want to double check it. But contracting, the fractional side is becoming more consistent. People want to naturally work for themselves. They want to have control over their schedules. They want to have control over like the flexibility they need in their life. And because of that, sometimes the borrow level is a great way to go about it. Plus, borrow might be sometimes it could be that midway between build and buy too. So maybe you have a level of capacity internally that could do this job, but you also know there's a lot of development needed and or there's parts of the work that need to get done now by an expert without any ramp up period. And so you might connect this contracted firm, this contracted individual consultant of some sort to come in and take over the things that need that expert right then. But this person might work with an internal team member who is building to take over something like that. Um, Other times it could be a matter of it's not a full time role and it doesn't make sense to bring someone in full time for this or to build someone full time into this role. And even if someone has capacity and like has the capability internally, they may not have the capacity to add to their workload too.
Right.
I think that's common with senior leaders, so that might be another reason you bring in the lever 3 borrow.
Yeah, I think all of those are really great points. And, there's also the financial component with that. And won't get too deep into that, but you might be looking at your finances and saying, we know that we need this specialization or we need this expertise.
Mhm.
And we are not financially at the place where we can commit to a massive salary. Right. And so this can be a really good kind of, to your point, bridge option between, kind of the building and the buying in other ways too, and this has been the case, specifically about an organization I worked with, and where they were trying to decide if they wanted to have an operations manager, not just the COO, but also an operations manager, right? And they just weren't quite ready to make that commitment to a position like that because they weren't sure how it was going to play out because they never had it before. And so it was a great opportunity for them to bring in a contractor who specialized in operations management and was able to kind of bring some ideas forward and kind of help navigate a few different scenarios so that they could kind of test whether it was something they wanted to make permanent. And I will say that I think that experience was really a cool one. It brought in some really fresh ideas, some cool projects, things I got to participate with as well. And ultimately, they did decide an operations manager was best for the organization, and they were able to then utilize that contractor, who I guess maybe was more fractional, if you will, but utilize that contractor to kind of get someone up to speed. And so applying their skill set in more of a developmental way than specifically to the organization. And you know what? I think that's really darn cool. So we can be creative. I think there's not, again, it's not everything has to be the,
Yes.
one way. And I think that's
Yeah.
cool.
And I default to thinking of the borrow lever as, you're needing that expert, that consultant, that really high level individual a lot of times. But I want to break it down. Who has used temp agencies in the past? Manufacturing units, especially like units that do a lot of filing type paperwork, usually less confidential for temps, but people that have a lot of like hands on, they can bring in multiple levels of workers at once for busy periods. Temps are considered borrowing as well. So I actually work with a lot of manufacturing units who do the borrow method within temps and temps alone. And sometimes these temps, based off of workload, may be brought on as full hire. And a lot of these temp agencies have the hire, like have the temp to hire framework as part of them. And so it's actually a helpful way to even recruit and buy down the road, borrowing in the meantime, exactly what Elizabeth was talking about.
Well, and there's a direct tie there to forecasting as well, which is kind of how we started this conversation. There's a direct tie there because you think about manufacturing as a whole, which is an industry I work a lot in. I have a lot of clients in manufacturing, and what what we see with their forecasting models is that there's often seasonal changes that occur as a
Hmm.
result of the product they create, right? I have one client who makes snowboards, for instance, right? They make snowboards for the winter months, right? And then they do water skis for the summer months, right? And so it changes, but the fluctuations based on the products they sell and the market that they are targeting require them to ramp up the number of people they have in production at certain points of the year because they need to prepare for those times, right? That is an amazing place to utilize the borrow method, right? If you know you can't keep someone on, all 12 months of the year, but you really need help in these specific months based on the forecasts that you've developed, that's a great time that you can use that borrow with the possibility, of course, to your point of potentially transitioning into a full hire.
And that's if it's necessary. It might not always be necessary. There's actually an interesting scenario. I don't remember the company exactly, but it was something I heard where a company, its workers went on strike. But guess who kept coming to work? Because they didn't technically work for this organization. The temps. And guess who got brought on full time? All of the temps. And so this company had a major, major, obviously very, external specialty type of situation, emergency. And the borrow method that they were utilizing ended up maintaining the organization for a
Yeah,
long period of time, or else the company could have gone through a major crisis and they didn't. And while, yes, to hear that some staff went on strike and something happened, maybe something not so positive happened, but that's not our place to judge. Our place is to help organizations
exactly.
forecast these situations. All in all, I do wanna, like, quickly note, like, what could go wrong with the borrow method. You're okay with that, Elizabeth?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that could go wrong is that you're treating the contractor more like a staff member. So, this was that transactional theory that Elizabeth brought up. And so, usually it's going to become, a little bit confrontational. That contractor might not want to continue to work with you. And then that borrow method could fail. Further, if there's contractor dependency where you're so reliant on this individual, then borrowing could become a norm, thus avoiding harder decisions and not actually forecasting properly. Um, and then if this contractor again walks out due to circumstances, then the company could find itself back where it started before it brought the contractor on, as well as the misclassification risk. So Elizabeth hinted to this earlier, the whole, how the states classify contractors, what can be a contractor, what can't be a contractor. For example, like you can't necessarily require a contractor to come to like staff meetings necessarily, right? You can't do that. If you do that and the contractor has to, then they could actually be considered an employee of the organization. So it's very important that there's like expectations put out, that scheduling is a collaborative effort between the company and the contractor.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's again, there's a lot there for sure. I mean, I'm thinking of one state in particular that like you can't tell a contractor to do anything really. But I do there's definitely, between like a full W-2 employee and then a 1099 contractor, there's just different considerations and different ways that you operate. But all in all, I think it's if it's something you're used to and you're willing to learn about, it's absolutely doable.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you for that. Yeah.
All in all, I feel like there are these 3 levers, the 3 Bs that you could go to. And it can be hard at times to decide which one is the best route. Obviously, had you had some forecasting previous, you may have already known which one would have been the best option. But sometimes you find yourself in an emergent situation. And at that point in time, you have to ask yourself a few questions. Elizabeth actually hinted to these earlier. But what are those questions? How do you choose which one, if not which ones on occasion? Usually you're using one, not multiple to use. Elizabeth, do you want to take us through those questions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think based on, job analysis and all of those pieces, we want to ask ourselves, what does the role actually require? What do we need? And what do we need now and what do we need in the future? So that's
And
the
then
first
organization
one.
too. Not just role, but organization, I'd argue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what does the role in the organization actually require? It's
Mm-hmm.
also, the second one is what does our talent inventory look like? Do
Mm-hmm.
you have the people that you need already and the resources to develop it? So taking a forward look at, if you do have folks internally, do you have the resources? If not, maybe considering one of those other levers.
Mm-hmm.
And the last part is really about what is the time horizon requirement, right? And what I mean when I say that is, are you looking ahead? When do you need this help? I can't tell you how many times people will call and say, we need to backfill this position, then let's say it's a CEO. I don't know, I'm just making something up, but like a CEO position, right? Should that happen 4 months before the CEO retires? I would argue absolutely not. It should be anywhere from I think 18 plus months to be realistic because you need to pass down that historical knowledge, to someone else. So that's where succession planning really comes in. And when we try to combine or we try to look at the overlap between the human elements and the forecasting that a lot of businesses are used to, the term time horizon in my mind is really synonymous with succession planning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. I feel like no matter where you're at, whether you're in a situation now where you have to choose one of these or not, I think you need to ask yourself these 3 questions now regarding each and every position at your organization. This is how you start forecasting is by saying, what happens if this person leaves? What happens if this other individual leaves? Do we have the capability to manage that? What is our plan? What would we have defaulted to usually? Start asking yourself some of these questions for those non redundant critical roles because
Absolutely.
maybe, just maybe, you'll start forecasting a little bit more. You might start highlighting that next fit who's at your organization, if there is one. Or you might start doing some research on what else is out there. Who else is out there? Is there anyone to contract even? If something would even be that a senior leader doesn't leave, but simply their time needs to be entirely focused elsewhere. And a big part of what they used to do is they can't handle anymore. So that's another question. It doesn't have to just be when someone leaves. It can also be when a major transition of responsibility happens too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think all of those things are very true. And realistically, what it boils down to in my mind is that it's creating a sense of maturity in operations as it applies to people, right? We already do a lot of work thinking about operational maturity in business, in finance, in marketing, in all of those areas or functional areas of a business. But what does that look like when we apply it to people? Right. And I just want to say this for all of our folks who are not in HR. This is not just an HR responsibility, right? Like, this is a leadership responsibility. And I think leadership teams should be considering both the financial impact as well as the people impact. And
Mhm.
that's, again, I could go on and on because I'm very passionate about it. But all in all, this conversation today just kind of leaves me a little bit with, when you're thinking about capability gaps, ask yourself which one of these levers is best in this scenario. right now. Take the time to evaluate whether building someone, buying a new candidate, that sounds awful, but you know what I mean, or borrowing, contracting would be the best choice for this particular gap that you're trying to fill. So, all in all, I think this was a great conversation. Seems like
Yeah,
we
I
have
loved
a
it.
few other conversations that we're going to have to make some podcasts about. As always happens, that tends to. So, I guess we'll conclude for today, and we will see all of our listeners shortly in the next week.
Yeah.
So, with that, this concludes another intriguing episode of Organizational Sherlocks. I'm Elizabeth Fleming.
And I'm Morgan Ashworth, reminding you that the journey to success is an ongoing investigation.
Stay curious, stay strategic, and keep utilizing insights to decode your business mysteries.
Join us every Friday for your next Who Done It. Let us know if there's something in this episode you want us to talk further on. And otherwise, this is Organizational Sherlock's closing today's case.
We will see you all next time.